I am Paolo Baracchi. I'm the coordinator of the Italian Historical Society here at Co.As.It. I am sitting in the Museo Italiano together with Bruno Leti, the artist whose works are currently on exhibition in the Museo. The exhibition has a suggestive title. It is called Paesaggi dell'Anima, Landscapes of the Soul, Italian Inspiration in Bruno Leti's Art. And Bruno and I are very happy to speak with you today on the occasion of the 2015 edition of the Piers Festival. And since the theme is the Pier, so it's clearly migration and arrival, I might start by asking Bruno a rather foreseeable yet nonetheless interesting question. Do you
About
have
my
any
memories, about my memories of arriving at Station Pier. Wow, I guess there are memories. Vague memories. I mean, I was only very young, 8.5. So I do remember arriving around about dusk, and that we were, you know, my mother and my two siblings searching out for who was waiting for us to pick us up. Of course, it was such a long time from the trip, and a long time that we had seen our father, which was 18 months prior. But eventually we got together by screaming and waving and, and all of that. It's interesting because Station Pier also became eventually one of those places where my father eventually found it a very good fishing spot. This was many years later.
Really?
Yes, it was very, very interesting. But anyway, apart from all of that, that's the memory of arrival, and I remember the people and screaming and getting together, the excitement of acknowledgement, all those sort of things. So that's my memory of 1952, a long time ago.
And what were your first impressions, Bruno, of Australia? You arrived as a child, presumably you didn't speak any English? Or?
No, none at all, of course. Dad had already arrived a year or so before us, and of course, in picking us up, that would take us to the place that we would be living in the next 2 or 3 years. That was in the country of Central Victoria, a place called Clonbinane, or Clonbinane Park, actually. The owner of the property was actually a gentleman who my father rescued during the war as a POW, and he was very kind to have offered Dad the passage a year or two before. They stayed in touch after the war, and eventually we got to the farm. My mother, my two siblings, and what were my impressions? I don't know. I really find it difficult to immediately accept those impressions which, as a child, it's very difficult to recollect and recall. But I do remember, perhaps, you know, particularly the next morning, waking up in the middle of nowhere with this beautiful house, which was the homestead, and being part of this whole new abode, which we had no prior connections, and it was very strange, very dislocating in a way. Yes.
You mentioned briefly the wartime story that eventually led to your arrival in this country. That's a very interesting story. I wonder whether you could tell us a few more words about.
Well, without elaborating too far, the person that my father rescued, Captain Arthur Jowett, Humphrey Jowett, actually, Arthur was his father, was shot down near Rome. He was imprisoned, and eventually, you know, they escaped. And people like my father would pick these escapees up and take them and clothe them and feed them, hide them, take all sorts of rescues and risks. And really, that's basically how they first met. An escapee means someone who looks after them, and that went on for a number of years. And of course, that friendship has still continued, and basically that's the early connection. But the real connection was their friendship during the war years and post-war years, and that they maintained this kind of connection ever since Humphrey returned to Australia. And that continued.
So Bruno, you come from a town in the region of Lazio, near Rome, is that?
Yes, a little place called Rock Antica, which is about 70 kilometres northeast of Rome. Very mountainous region. It's almost on the corner of Abruzzi and Umbria and Lazio. So that little corner where it's very, very beautiful landscape, very beautiful area. And of course, I had my first childhood growing up until I was 8.5. And I certainly do have fond memories of that.
Since we are speaking with an artist, I think the question about the visual stimuli and the cultural environment of your early years is an apt one. So,
well, you know, in a country town, you go to your little school and you have your friends and you do all the things that children do. But I think that I do remember perhaps naturally the beauty of the Campagna and the landscape. But we also had another thing, is that the weekend we had a group of people who would always come from maybe the city or surrounding area. I think in Italian they're called vedutisti, and they would paint, you know, the local landscape as you see it, and quite beautiful. That was my kind of memory of that part of the childhood in relationship to creating a visual image, perhaps, you know, the idea of the landscape.
After the age of 8.5, when you arrived in Australia, you followed the normal stages of an Australian child and then teenager, young man growing up. Can I ask you, when did it dawn on you that you might want to pursue art as the central...
Well, again, you know, as a child on a farm, I was very interested in nature, first of all. I loved animals. I liked the idea of colours and the idea of the shapes of this landscape, which was rather foreign at the time, but very beautiful. And maybe perhaps later part of high school, I think I was aware of the fact that I had something within me that wanted to express things physically and visually. I was good at drawing, I was good at painting, I had very good teachers, and so perhaps, you know, these are the early moments. I was curious about the land, the farm. I would be drawing implements and little landscapes and houses and what have you, and perhaps that was sort of the beginning of some creative notion. And I was always reading stories, and I can remember being given a book as a gift departing from Italy. It was called Il Pino delle Rondini, and these little books, these little fables, you know, told stories, and somehow that connected between what you know and what you don't know and what you see, and somehow this creative part of you in your character. I don't know where it comes from. I think it's just intuition, a lot of it, and it just happens.
So you left Italy when you were 8.5.
Yes.
How old were you when you went back to Italy for the first time?
For the first time, I had already been married, and my wife and I had already been teaching at a high school for several years, and then I decided that it was time to discover what we had learned. So probably I was about 26, 27 when I made my first trip back to the big tour of Europe, as a lot of people used to do in those days, you know, the grand tour, as it was called, of the museums, the countries, the art galleries, the churches, architecture, all these beautiful things that we read about. And I remember actually finding a little place in Ostia, near Ostia Antica, in fact, not far from the airport. And it was very interesting to have found a place that eventually I also did some teaching to. And we have, you know, our travels began from there, and we had a little place of our own. And it was from there that we made our plans to travel through Europe and so on. But I was also teaching part-time at a little place in Ostia called Enoch. And I was the Australian teacher, the English teacher. And it was quite exciting. It kept you in touch with the language, meeting people. But, you know, our travels throughout Europe were from there. And the big churches, the big museums, and yes, that lasted nearly 2 years.
You have had many exhibitions of your work by now. You're an established Australian artist, but I seem to remember that your very first exhibition was held in Rome.
Yes, it was. Maybe it wasn't my very first. I did have a little country exhibition in my little country town of Broadford, but the official first exhibition was in Rome, in Via Babuino. And in fact, it was opened by a very famous older artist by the name of Giorgio De Chirico, of course, as we know, a great artist. Yes, that was paintings of memories of my early travels in Europe, oil paintings, and this actually was quite well exposed. It got a little bit of news on Ray television, and it was quite exciting. But that set me off.
Just another question, Bruno, about the moment of departure in Italy, what you left behind, leaving as a child.
That is something I have very, very good memories of, because it was very clear. I can remember when we left Rome, my uncle Gustavo, who's my senior uncle, whom I've actually adored. In fact, I have made books dedicated to my uncle Gustavo, who was my father's eldest brother. He was always the catalyst in making things happen. And in his big Fiat 1100 in those days, he volunteered to take us from Rome all the way to Naples. And of course there was my mother, my two siblings, my auntie, and Zio Gustavo, uncle. He was a wonderful guy. He was very, very generous, spontaneous. And I remember having a wonderful farewell lunch in a lovely restaurant by the water, not far from where the ship was. And sort of remember the sad moments of leaving and stories. But as children, you know, you don't worry about the emotional part that much. It was sad, obviously, but that were the memories before we boarded the ship, which was called the Sorrento, and that was quite fascinating.
During your whole lifetime, you have maintained and cultivated a strong relationship with Italy, not only memories, but we are talking about travel, about work in Italy, and about a constant engagement with the Italian artistic tradition, with Italian literature as well. I wonder whether you could say just a few concluding remarks about this exhibition, which retraces the Italian inspiration in almost 50 years of
activity.
Artistic work.
This exhibition pretty much is a summary of my life, I suppose. From childhood, suddenly here we are, you know, 60 years later. We've got an exhibition of influences of my culture that particularly, let's say, with a painting behind me. The Florentine Garden is a summary of my memories of beautiful Italian visits to gardens. As we know, Italians almost invented the idea of a domestic garden, the beauty of gardens. So, you know, whether it was Tivoli or whether it was Florence or whether it was Milano. this exhibition really is a summary, if you like, of a lifetime of work. Although the emphasis is on Italian memories and Italian influences, whether it's by poets, writers, or whatever, it is fundamentally also a little summary, if you like, a mini retrospective of a long period of history and a long period of painting. But not only painting, printmaking, drawing, photography, various other institutions like that. And fundamentally, that's the crux of this exhibition.